What if the most effective medicine cabinet ever assembled wasn't in a pharmacy? It was growing wild in the dirt, and the people who built it spent thousands of years figuring out exactly how to use it. We're talking about plants with actual clinical evidence behind them. Anti-inflammatory compounds, immune-modulating chemistry, antimicrobial properties that modern labs are still trying to catch up with. Today, we're going through 10 of them, and by the end, you're going to see land management and native plant preservation in a completely different way. Number 1, Echinacea, purple coneflower. Walk into any pharmacy and you'll find Echinacea on the shelf, usually in a capsule, usually overpriced, and the label tells you almost nothing useful. Plains tribes from the Cheyenne to the Sioux were using this plant for sore throats, fevers, snake bites, and infected wounds long before any lab ran an assay on it. The question isn't whether it works. It's whether that pill actually delivers what the root in the ground was doing. And that's where it gets complicated, because there are at least 3 Echinacea species in commercial use: Purpurea, Angustifolia, and Pallida, and they don't behave the same way. Number 2, Yarrow. Achillea millefolium gets its name from the Greek myth that Achilles used it to stop his soldiers bleeding, and that same convergence shows up across dozens of cultures that had zero contact with each other. Pacific Northwest tribes, Great Plains tribes, European battlefield medics, all landing on the same plant for the same wounds. That's not coincidence. That's repeated observation producing the same result. The reason it worked so consistently is actually written right into its chemistry. Yarrow's tannins cause vasoconstriction and speed up clotting at the wound surface. So applied as a poultice, it's doing what a modern styptic does, except it's simultaneously delivering antimicrobial compounds directly into the wound. No single pharmaceutical compound does both at once. Number 3, sage. Salvia apiana, white sage, and the Salvia officinalis in your spice rack share a genus and a name, and that's about where the similarity ends. One got selected over generations for its resin content. The other got bred for mild flavor and high yield, so it produces a fraction of the protective compounds that made the original plant worth using. Smudging gets dismissed as spiritual theater, but burning sage releases camphor, thujone, and cineole into the air, and a study in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology found that medicinal smoke in a confined space cut airborne bacterial populations by over 90%, with the effect lasting up to 24 hours. That's infection control, not ceremony. Number 4, sweetgrass. Hierocloe odorata smells like vanilla and fresh hay, and that scent comes from coumarin, the same class of molecule that gave us warfarin, one of the most widely prescribed blood thinners in the world. So when Anishinaabe and Lakota traditions describe sweetgrass as sacred, there's actual chemistry underneath that framing. The braid isn't just ceremonial either. Braiding slows oxidation of the volatile oils and keeps the active compounds stable for months. It's a storage system. But sweetgrass only grows in healthy, wet prairie soil. It won't colonize disturbed ground, so when it disappeared from an area, that told you the land was sick before any other indicator did. Number 5, cedar. Thuja occidentalis, cedar, produces a class of compounds called thujaplecins, and these aren't mild antimicrobials. They disrupt cell membranes in bacteria and fungi without the same toxicity to human cells, which is exactly what you want from any useful antimicrobial agent. Tribes were using cedar in healing spaces, food storage, and wound care long before anyone understood germ theory, and the chemistry completely supports those choices. Scratch or cut cedar wood and it releases those oils immediately. That's why steaming cedar leaf tips work so well for respiratory infections. You're basically running a low-tech nebulizer, delivering antimicrobial and expectorant compounds directly to the airway. The Sweat Lodge took that same chemistry and ran it at full scale, in an enclosed space, at high heat, on everyone inside at once. Number 6, willow. Aspirin is the best-selling pharmaceutical compound in history, and it exists because of willow bark. Salix species, white willow, black willow, crack willow, contain salicin, a compound the body converts to salicylic acid after ingestion. Biochemists synthesized that into acetyl salicylic acid in the 1890s, and built a global business around it. Native American tribes had been using willow bark for fever, pain, and inflammation for centuries before that synthesis. The pharmaceutical industry didn't discover the mechanism. They patented a version of it. What the aspirin story usually leaves out is that willow bark extract produces a slower, more sustained anti-inflammatory response than aspirin does, because salicin hydrolyzes gradually rather than hitting your system all at once. That slower release also means less gastrointestinal irritation than high doses of pure acetyl-salicylic acid tend to cause. The bark also contains polyphenols and flavonoids that appear to hit additional anti-inflammatory pathways. So when you isolate one compound, you get a faster effect and lose the supporting chemistry. Traditional preparation reflects that complexity. Simmering bark for an extended period hydrolyzes the salicin into more bioavailable forms. Chewing fresh bark releases the compounds more slowly, which suits chronic joint pain better than acute fever. Different preparations for different conditions. None of it written down, all of it encoded in practice across generations. Willows grow in riparian zones, along riverbanks and stream edges, so tribes that manage watersheds carefully were also maintaining their most reliable anti-inflammatory medicine. The difference between willow bark and aspirin isn't potency, it's intellectual property. Number 7, juniper. Juniperus communis grows out of granite cracks, thin alkaline soil, and slopes that get blasted with UV all summer. That kind of stress isn't incidental to the plant's chemistry. It's the cause of it. Secondary metabolites, the terpenes, flavonoids, and phenolic acids that make juniper medicinally useful are what the plant produces under pressure as a defense system. Traditional use covered urinary infections, joint pain, respiratory illness, and skin conditions, which initially sounds like an overreach. But terpenen 4-ol, the primary active compound in juniper berry extracts, shows diuretic, antimicrobial, and anti-inflammatory activity. Lab data shows COX inhibition from a cold water fruit extract, which maps directly onto those traditional anti-inflammatory applications. A nursery juniper getting regular water and fertilizer won't produce the same chemical load as one fighting for survival on a rocky slope. The stress is what drives the output. So the traditional insistence on harvesting from specific wild locations wasn't cultural preference. It was quality specification, and it was correct. Number 8, wild bergamot, bee balm. Monarda fistulosa grows in roadsides and dry prairie edges, the kind of ground most plants won't touch, and across the Great Plains and eastern woodlands, it was a primary medicine for respiratory infections, skin conditions, and fevers. The Ojibwe, Blackfoot, and Cherokee all used it independently, across very different ecosystems for overlapping conditions. That geographic spread tells you something. It wasn't cultural transmission. It was repeated observation producing the same result. The active compound is thymol, the same molecule used as the active ingredient in Listerine. Thymol disrupts bacterial cell membranes, and it's volatile, so traditional teas and steam preparations were delivering it directly to the airway where respiratory pathogens live. Number 9, mullein. Verbascum thapsus is a European plant that Native American tribes adopted within a generation or two of contact, and that rapid uptake tells you something real. These weren't people borrowing cultural practices. They were observing outcomes and adding a new tool because it worked. The mechanism is straightforward. Mullein leaves contain mucilage, a polysaccharide gel that physically coats irritated mucous membranes when you drink it as tea. The saponins in the leaf act as expectorants by reducing the surface tension of mucus, making it thinner and easier to clear. That's the same basic mechanism as guaifenesin, the active ingredient in most commercial expectorants sold today. Thick, congested coughs responded to mullein. Dry coughs didn't, which is exactly what the saponin chemistry predicts. Number 10, tobacco, used ceremonially and medicinally in many tribes. No plant in this entire list has been more thoroughly wrecked by industrial use than Nicotiana tabacum. And the wreckage isn't accidental. Commercial tobacco varieties got selectively bred for one thing: maximum nicotine delivery, maximum addiction. That's a different plant from the Nicotiana rustica that tribes used ceremonially. And many native communities have drawn that line clearly, actively discouraging commercial cigarette use precisely because of what the industry engineered into it. Traditional use kept exposure low and infrequent, tied to ceremony and specific healing contexts, never daily, never habitual. At low doses, nicotine acts on acetylcholine receptors in ways researchers are still investigating for inflammatory conditions. The compound isn't the problem. The dose, the frequency, and the 500 additives are. Every plant we've covered makes its most useful chemistry under stress. Poor soil, high UV, drought, pathogen pressure. That's not a coincidence across 10 plants. That's a pattern, and it means degrading native ecosystems doesn't just cost us biodiversity. It strips out the exact conditions that make these plants pharmacologically potent in the first place. The 7 generations framing wasn't poetry. It was a realistic maintenance schedule for a working pharmaceutical system. So if you want to act on this, plant native species, support native plant nurseries, and push back on herbicide use in riparian zones. The medicine chest isn't gone. It's just growing in the margins.